Good news for political junkies. The election campaign. It actually started today, unofficially. It's probably going to be a 5 or 6 month campaign, I'd say, because the Morrison government's going to need every week of campaigning to persuade voters to give it another chance because it's so far behind in the polls. Now, the Prime Minister was today in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, coal mining territory, to win 3 Labor seats there. The seat of Hunter, where local member Joel Fitzgibbon is retiring, that's held by a margin of 3%. And then there's the seat of Paterson, held by Labor by 5%, and the seat of Shortland, held by Labor by 4.5%. Now, all of them are going to be tough for the government to win, but win them they must, because the government needs to actually win seats simply to stay in power and probably lose some in Queensland, maybe Victoria, even Western Australia. At this stage, it's looking pretty hopeless or pretty grim for the Liberals. But Scott Morrison does now have something to sell. And today he looked reinvigorated a bit. Now, it's not just that we're now one of the most vaccinated countries on earth with an economy better than most. There's also his global warming policy. Now, you might think it's strange for me to say, hey, there's this global warming policy. And look, I stand by it. It's an absolute joke. It's a surrender to wokedom. It won't do what he claims it will, but at least it's not as bad as Labor's, or what we know of Labor's. It's keeping details pretty stum. And Morrison today was promising coal miners in the Hunter that he'll at least bring them green energy jobs as well.
Our plans to move to a lower emissions future very much have the Hunter at the centre of our thinking. Everything we do, every plan we have, every investment we're making is making sure it works here in the Hunter.
All sounds very good, until you realise that his plan for the Hunter depends on turning, for instance, this model of a hydrogen plant, tiny little model that he's looking at, into a real plant that works on an industrial scale, producing hydrogen that actually works too. You see, for all the talk about hydrogen, it's actually a very expensive, highly inflammable, hard to transport gas that might not at all be the godsend that the government and Labor too, mind you, are both claiming.
The world will be able to plug in to Australia's hydrogen industry well into the future.
Joining me is the political panel, Michael Kroger, former Victorian Liberal President, and Michael Costa, former New South Wales Labor Treasurer. Michael Kroger, the election campaign starts now. The Liberals are throwing everything into winning seats around the Hunter Valley. They have to survive. Can they pull this off?
Well, Andrew, they have to win seats in New South Wales. I think this is the bottom line. There's 7 seats under 5% outside Sydney, the Sydney metropolitan area. Look, I don't think they can win any more in Queensland or West Australia. They're going to shed seats in those states. They've already got, 30 in Queensland, 11 in West Australia. They've got humongous results there. The last election, 58.5% of the vote in Queensland, 55.5% in West Australia against 51.5% nationally. So if you expect 1 or 2 losses there, they've got to pick up a few in New South Wales. So I think Scott was right to start there because that's where the fertile ground is. Maybe a seat in Tasmania they can win, maybe one in the Northern Territory. But if they win 3 or 4 in New South Wales, they've got a good chance of holding government. So that was the place he started, and that's where he's going to be for a lot of the next 6 months, I think.
I'd say that Tasmania's not looking that great. I mean, they had a high watermark result in Tasmania as well, but you might be right. You know more about these things, I suspect. I don't know. Michael Costa, is that how you see it?
Absolutely not. And I'm in the Hunter. I can tell you that announcement today was an absolute joke. And I say this as somebody that thought he could win prior to this net zero policy. We've got thousands of jobs up here in both coal mining and electricity and all of the associated services that depend on it. And that Mickey Mouse proposal that I saw today for a potentially 40 megawatt hydrogen-based plant is a joke. 40 megawatts wouldn't even power, a small suburb, and I'm talking maybe six or 7,000 homes. These jobs are under threat immediately in the perception of these guys. I know that the government's running around saying, this is downstream, but that's not how people feel up here. They feel that their livelihoods, you think of somebody in their 20s that's starting off in that industry. I mean, that time frame is one that frightens them in terms of their expectations. So I think they're in real trouble. The only thing that can save Scott Morrison is if Labor comes out with something even crazier than he's announced. These Mickey Mouse projects are not going to wash. They're going to lose seats. Look, they won't pick up any seats in the Hunter Valley. The only one that's in play is Joel's, and I think that's more likely to go back to Labor with preferences from some of the minor parties. Certainly the other two seats they will hold. That means they're going to lose seats in Queensland. I think they've got real problems, and I think those problems were caused by themselves with this Mickey Mouse policy to get a headline before a climate conference that was a fizzer, as I predicted it would be. Sorry, that's the reality.
I wonder how many people in coal mines who feel endangered are going to think, oh, well, great, there's a hydrogen plant coming, so I might be able to get a job there instead. I don't know if that sells, and I wonder even how much faith this government has in hydrogen. When the Prime Minister today announced a grant of just $1.5 million in a partnership with the Port of Newcastle to study out setting up a hydrogen hub. What sort of commitment's that?
So, Andrew, I would think Scott will try and wrestle Labor to the ground on this issue quickly and then get on to interest rates as the issue for the election, because you cannot win an election on hydrogen. You know, if you were Malcolm Turnbull, Andrew, you'd explain it this way. Hydrogen is a chemical element found largely in water. If you separate oxygen from water, you're left with hydrogen, which is so light it floats up into the ether. 4 stars are made of hydrogen. It fuels the sun, but it's never been commercially viable as a fuel. Now, do you blue-collar workers feel better? That's the problem, Andrew. It is so complicated, difficult and impossible to explain. And it's never been commercially viable. There are over 30 hydrogen projects already that, you know, dozens or more that ARENA are funding. It's not possible to win an election on hydrogen. I mean, because that's the explanation of what it is, right? It's impossible to explain to anybody. It's like Malcolm's, you know, incubator hubs in the 16 campaign where the future is out there in the cloud. Well, truck drivers in Cranbourne gave the 2-finger salute to the cloud because they're worried about their truck and their mortgage. Yeah. So Morrison has to get off this subject and get on to something which affects the lives of every single Australian, and that is that the risks that interest rates will go up under a free-spending Labor government as they got up to 90% under Paul Keating.
Well, the problem with that, Michael, is, you know, the problem with that is, and I agree with you that the strength that the coalition has got is economics, but interest rates are going up. We can see that. The Reserve has been outfoxed by the bond market already. Its expectation of no interest rate increases for at least 2 years has been brought forward. We've got inflation everywhere. We saw what's happening in the US, and it's happening here as well. You just have to look at the petrol bowser. I'm talking about real inflation, the inflation that people feel in their hip pockets, not the one that's measured by the CPI. So I think he's going to be in trouble there. And the reckless spending. You know, let's not forget the reckless spending, you know, that both sides have been involved in. You know, it's pretty hard to have good economic credentials when you're running, you know, $700 billion worth of gross debt. You know, it's just...
Putting money directly into the pockets of small business people and businesses and individuals through JobKeeper is not considered by them to be reckless spending. If you get into economics, as the election issue, Andrew, this is what we know. Morrison and Frydenberg look like number 1 and 2 batsmen, but Albanese looks like a number 7 batsman on the economy, and Chalmers looks like a very eager number 9 batsman who wants to go higher in the list, but his form is not that good.
All true, but governments lose elections.
Then Labor will lose the election.
No, look, that's all true.
Yeah, but I agree with you that Albanese and Chalmers versus those two, I agree with you, but I just think policy-wise, the differences are blurring. And Albanese, Michael Costa, just quickly finish on you, just a minute left. Albanese seems to me determined to be a small target. And so far he's got completely away from it. I show no sign that he'll break that discipline.
I've known Anthony for many, many years when he was a factional operative in Young Labor. He's a shrewd political operator, shrewder than Bill Shorten in many regards. And I think you'll see a very calculated, small target with some strategic, you know, forays into policy areas where you think he can pick up votes. I wouldn't write off Albanese. I mean, you know, I would have written him off before the net zero, but I think they're in big trouble.
I think you're probably right. Michael Kroger, Michael Costa, will come back to this topic in future weeks. Thank you so much for your time.